Commissioners, we're going to start in 2 minutes. If everybody could please take their seats, we're going to start in just a moment. To our Shelby County Commissioners, our mayor, our elected officials, and our guests, to our media partners and friends, we reconvene the Shelby County Board of Commissioners of Shelby County, Tennessee, this day, Wednesday, May 27th, 2020. It's 10:30. Commissioners, we're going to go for another hour, and then I've asked the Peabody if we could take a very brief break for lunch. Because of COVID, they'll bring you your lunch at 11:30. We'll take a very short break to eat, and then we'll go right back into our meeting for as long as we need to. So when we adjourned, the last person in the queue was Commissioner Wright, who is up next. But let me go back. Commissioner Ford, you were done at that point. So let's now go. For those people who are the listening public, and for those people in the room, we are on item 4 as amended so far. We also had a motion on the floor by Commissioner Turner for a recommendation, which we have not voted on yet. But let's go to Commissioner Wright. Commissioner Wright, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if this is the best time to bring this up or not, but it came to my attention that perhaps Shelby County has not dealt with this consideration of what happens with vacation time for county employees. So I'd love to hear from the administration on any county employees who are perhaps having to lose their vacation time or not take vacation during this crisis. Are these funds something that could be considered for them, or have we already given thought to that?
Let me go to Dr. Hall as it relates to item number 4. Is there any CARES funding that would go toward those type of needs, Dr. Hall?
Good morning. At this time, that is not a consideration. However, our HR department is looking and reviewing our policies to identify a way to ensure that our employees who have not been able to utilize their vacation and other PTO opportunities, we're coming out. We will come back with an opportunity to explain how we will handle that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good question, Commissioner Wright. Vice Chairman Jones.
So, Dr. Hall, let me ask this question. If the employees on their anniversary date, and that's how they do their vacation, are we looking at ways to say some of these anniversary dates is right in the middle of this pandemic, and has there been an extension so that the employees don't lose that while they're not able to utilize their vacation?
Yes, sir. Commissioner Jones. So the HR department, Stephen Massey is not here today, And we will be more than happy to come back before the body to explain all of the provisions and considerations that are being taken into account. But we will be looking at ways, and if I'm recalling correctly, the probationary periods for employees were relaxed as a part of the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of those concerns that you've expressed have already been addressed. But we will be more than happy as an HR department to come back and specifically address those concerns in more detail.
Okay. I guess for me, because I know we can use these funds for hazardous pay, but these are also directly related to COVID, because we said you're on the front line, first responders. You can't use your vacation, but my anniversary date is right in the middle of that, and I will lose it if you guys hadn't extended or made a point so that they don't lose that funding. I think that's very critical in this process to ensure that they're not losing anything because we said we need you. We need you up front. Can't you utilize your vacation? I don't want them to lose it because we need them. And just come up with some type of procedure that extends that until we come out of this, I think would be appropriate. And I've already spoken with Director Massey concerning this, but I just want to make sure that we're doing those things so that there's been a lot of concern from the employees relating to this issue.
Yes, sir. Commissioner Jones, again, we will be more than happy to present those policies and procedures and considerations. Chief Leach just advised me that the Sheriff's Office already extends those for their employees. So we will be more than happy. Today we are prepared to speak to the CARES Act and the funding for the CARES Act, but we will prepare, if it is the will of this body, a formal presentation on how those things will be handled.
All right. Thank you.
Good questions, Vice Chair. Thank you, Dr. Hall. Commissioners, I'm at a point where I don't have anybody in the queue. Does anybody have a question? CFO Crosby, you have the floor.
Thank you. Today, the first, number 3 or number 1, because it was flipped, was Commissioner Jones's recommendation to provide hazard pay. And this was something that we are easily able to change in the mayor's proposed resolution if you would accept a slight amendment to that this morning. In the exhibits that are before you now, the hazard pay for county employees would be changed to $1,245,000, and the Shelby County Government Fall Contingency Reserve Fund would be amended by the same amount to $9,876,776. So that provides the hazard pay for those fire department employees.
And you're saying that that could come out of COVID?
That is an amendment to this COVID resolution that is currently on the floor, yes.
I move it.
It was moved by Commissioner Jones, seconded by Commissioner Ford. Are there questions on the amendment on item number 4? Can we do that by acclamation? Seeing no objection. Very good. Thank you so much, CFO Crosby. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At this point, are there any other questions? Right now, Commissioner Turner, we have your motion that was properly seconded on the floor. My understanding, again, I think, just so you and I, everybody else on the same page, it's a recommendation to the mayor.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, any other questions on Commissioner Turner's amendment? I think you've also made it clear that if dollars come from another source, you would not be your intention to add on.
Correct.
Commissioners, does anybody have any other questions on the Turner amendment? Okay. Let's vote on, or let me ask you this, Commissioners, can we accept the Turner amendment by acclamation, or do you want to vote? Seeing no objection, we accept the Turner amendment. Parliamentarian, did you get that? Okay. just summarize, I think we've recorded this and it's on the record, but if you'll just restate it, your intent.
Yes, sir. This is a recommendation for 3.3 to be used for the mental health care of inmates, with two exceptions. One, if the funding is coming through the WellPath contract, we don't use this money. And two, if we don't find a sustainable source for a sustainable annual source, then we don't use it.
Yeah, I think, Chief Crosby, can you repeat for the parliamentarian so that she can get those numbers right and adjust them? Again, I think that's what, before we vote on this, to make sure that she has what she needs to have the correct numbers.
Certainly. $1,245,000 for the hazard pay for county employees, and $9,876,776 for the fall contingency reserve fund.
Okay.
That was properly moved and seconded and accepted with acclamation of the commissioners. Thank you. Now we're on the Turner Amendment. Unless there's objection, we'll accept that by acclamation. Okay, the Turner Amendment is passed. Thank you, Commissioner Turner, and thank you, Commissioners, for your feedback on that. Commissioners, we are still on item number 4. Is there any other discussion on item number 4 as amended? Okay, are we all ready to vote on item number 4? I'm going to do a roll call vote since this is a very substantial amount of money, and just for the record. So let's prepare the screens to vote for item number 4.
Commissioner Turner,
Aye.
Morrison,
Aye.
Sawyer,
Aye.
Whaley,
Aye.
Wright,
Aye.
Milton,
Aye.
Brooks,
Aye.
Bradford,
Aye.
Ford,
Aye.
Mills,
Aye.
Lowry,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Chairman Billingsley.
Aye.
We have aye votes from Commissioners Turner, Morrison, Sawyer, Whaley, Wright, Milton, Brooks, Bradford, Ford, Mills, Lowry, Jones, and Chairman Billingsley. We have 13 aye votes.
Item 4 passes. Commissioner, we're halfway through our agenda. Really good progress. So we've dispensed with item number 3 and item number 4. Item parliamentarian, if you please read item number 1.
Yes, sir. Item 1 comes from the Budget and Finance Committee, which is chaired by Commissioner Jones. Item 1 is a resolution approving and appropriating Shelby County government's operating budget for fiscal year FY 2021 by adopting the FY 2020 operating budget as amended by the Budget and Finance Committee, and to reduce FY 20 budget with non-recurring line items costs as adjusted. Sponsored by Commissioner Eddie S. Jones Jr. and Commissioner Edmund Ford Jr., this item was deferred in May 18th, 2020 Commission meeting.
Very good.
Second.
It was moved by Commissioner Edmund Ford, seconded by Commissioner Eddie Jones Jr. Commissioner Jones, can I get a report, please?
Oh, this item.
Number 1.
Yeah, number 1. We sent this down to this meeting, this special call meeting. So it was sent from the previous meeting to this meeting.
Very good. Thank you.
No recommendations, just sent it.
Very good. It was deferred. Thank you so much, Vice Chairman. Okay, Commissioners. Regarding, no, I don't have anything. Our Vice Chairman of Budget, Edmund Ford, you have the floor.
All right,
Item number
Chairman.
1.
Thank you. If you could entertain a few items, what I'd like to do As we've gone through this budget and amendments have come through, what I'd like to do, especially with the conversation that we've had with item 4, if we could put the amendments that actually add to the budget to the side so that we can look to see what qualifies as COVID and what doesn't. When we do that, according to the numbers that I've gotten from others, the number that was floated around prior to the cuts that were passed was 16.9 million. The cuts as passed, just looking at the general fund, takes us to an $8.9 million shortfall. And with the notes that I have here, there are some amendments that I believe that if we could consider upon their passage, we could look at eliminating that $8.9 million shortfall. So, Chairman, if it's appropriate, what I like to do is, and I have a set of amendments here, some of these amendments are also some that I know that Commissioner Morrison was looking at. However, we had a little conversation. I think that some of the numbers needed to be looked at again, and I'll explain that when I get to that particular point. But in order to get us back in the black prior to entertaining the funding of any other amendments that actually add, I'd like to entertain some other cuts that I know that I've looked at, I know that Commissioner Morrison has looked at, to attempt to bring us to a net zero if at best. So one of the questions, and I know that I talked to a couple people in the administration, I've asked them to give me some other numbers that are outside of affecting the Sheriff's Division, because I know last week that was one of the major questions. So, Chairman, if it's all right with you, and I'll lean a little bit on Commissioner Morrison regarding some of these. So, the first one that I would like to look at, and I've asked this question to make sure that some of the there's a $4.9 million where if the budget goes back to actual salaries, including fringes, it will not affect the salary increases that Commissioner Mills and I introduced last year. Asking about that because I just wanted to make sure that nobody was going backwards before we pass this budget. So there's a $4.9 million savings that can occur if the budget is taken back to actual salaries, including fringes. And according to the admin, this should not affect the raises that were purposed by Commissioner Mills and I last year, and this should not affect public safety as well. I did ask that question. So what I like to do is move that the budget goes back to actual salaries, including fringes. This would be a net savings of $4.9 million, and if Commissioner Morrison wanted to respond to that and be my seconder.
I would second, and at the same time, maybe want to ask the administration just to make sure we're not overlapping cuts because of the ones that were done previously.
Commissioner Morrison, are you directing your question to the CFO or who?
Is anyone in the administration?
Okay. Ms. Crosby?
Thank you. There are two different ways to take these cuts. One is by department. That's what the mayor did in the proposed budget. The other is by line item. Line item is something such as travel or fringe benefits. When you take reductions by department and by line item, there is overlap. In the amendments that were adopted last week, there is overlap. There was an amendment for the elected officials, and there was an amendment for budget reductions. 6 of the elected officials would be worse off with the proposed amendments that were adopted last week than they would have been with the mayor's proposed budget, because there was overlap in those lines that were adjusted. One of the main ways that we were going to work with the departments to implement the proposed reductions in the mayor's budget was by taking the budgeted salaries back to actuals. That is one of the primary ways that those departments were actually achieving the budget reductions in the mayor's proposal. So by adopting another amendment that specifically calls that out, those departments will have to make deeper cuts in their budgets in other lines. And those reductions would likely lead to layoffs. So just to know that those line item cuts that are in Commissioner Morrison's budget is one way of looking at it. The mayor's proposed budget was by department. There is significant overlap between those two.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to respond if I
Okay,
could.
thank you, CFO Crosby. Before I go to you, Commissioner Ford, were you finished, Commissioner Morrison?
He and I maybe are on the same track as far as, it sounds like then where we are with the Ford Jones budget was by, it was by department. But so there would be overlap with the way my amendment was written, is what you're saying.
The Ford Jones or the Commission Budget Committee actually included overlap and included some cuts by department and other cuts by line item.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Morrison. Back to Commissioner Edmund Ford.
And thank you for that information. So this is where communication is very important. So this is where I wish, well, we can do this next year, make sure that the communication is both ways on the front end. But when we were inundated with so many emails regarding what the electeds could do in contrast to what the administration wanted to cut, in order to show, I would say, good faith effort, that's when that First Amendment came into play. I understand what you're saying as far as line items and whatnot are concerned, but when Commissioner Jones and I came up with those amendments, I wish there was a little conversation as far as the dollar amounts of possible overlap then, because when I was looking at the line items, I think, and Commissioner Jones, I'm not going to speak for you, but when we looked at that 612-page budget, in order to prevent some of that overlap that you're talking about, that's why we looked at every other division that was not on that first cut list. So my question would be, how much would it be if it's not a true 4.9? What would it necessarily be? Because one thing that I do want to do, Chairman, even if it's after this budget, the communication didn't happen at the beginning, but it's going to happen before the 8th. And I hope that whatever we come up with when we leave here, that the communication with the electeds does happen, so that if particular line items, let's say that one of the clerks got cut by $50,000, can we give latitude for those clerks to say exactly what line items that $50,000 is going to come from? Can we do that before we get to the 8th, so that we won't have another problem? So if it involves, and this is why we're having the conversation, Chairman, so that we can figure this out, because if we're at an $8.9 million shortfall, it's the goal of this commissioner to try to get us down to 0 or better. And if it takes more than one of us to figure it out, let's go ahead and figure it out. I think Commissioner Jones was next, but I yield.
Really good comments, Commissioner Ford. Vice Chairman Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. And I guess the bigger concern for me right now is this. And I know we keep referencing back to the proposed budget. What is on the table, what we voted on, is the FY20 budget and moving forward. That's what's on the table. Now, what has to be corrected first is the use of these funds, because the FY20 budget was $24 million less than the proposed budget. And when I look at, in the book, personnel in the proposed budget increased by $3 million from what the amended FY20 budget was. When I look in it for education, it went down to 4.27. But when I look at operation and maintenance in the proposed budget from the amended FY20 budget, 22,279,618. These are the use of these funds. And I could keep going down from the FY20, which is less. I think that's what's on the table and what we ought to be talking about. When we started, the report that we got on the FY20 budget, we started off with $7 million deficit. I don't even count the CIP because we had a planned use for it, because we had excess funds in that account. But when we decided to go back to the FY20, the deficits increased. I don't understand that. If you coming out of it with one deficit, how going back to it increases the deficits? So what's on the table is the FY20 budget. Let's talk about that. Let's make the adjustments. If there's different amounts of funds for revenue and expenditures, let's start there. Then we're going to know how far off we are. And without doing that, speaking from two different budgets, it is going to get confusing. So what's on the table is the FY20 budget being repeated as the FY21. So that's what we should go from, based on revenues, switch them in, so that we will have a true picture of any projected deficits. So can we start there before we go any further with this? Because we're not going to get anywhere going back and forth between both of these budgets without coming up with some real true numbers. That's what I would like to see, Chairman.
Thank you, Budget Chair and Vice Chairman Jones. I think Ms. Crosby wants to be recognized.
Yes, please.
Matilda Crosby.
Chairman Jones, one of the points that you raised was an increase in some lines in the 21 proposed budget. The majority of that increase was in the grants funds. It was not in the general fund. It was for planning and development and the resiliency construction. It was for health services with a Ryan White HIV grant. And it was netting out the fact that the Workforce Investment Network is spinning off into a nonprofit. But those were the main changes in the overall all funds budget. What we need to resolve is the deficit in the general fund. Those grant funds, there's only 1.6 million of county match from the general fund going towards 180 million of grant funds. That's a very small match for the amount of grant funding that we get. If we actually look at just the general fund, the personnel increase, it did go up in the proposed by $3 million, but the primary reason for that is that salary increase that went into effect January 1st, there's a full year of that. We now don't have just 6 months of that salary increase. The other change is that there was a mandated incremental 10% lapse that was set by the commission last summer for the fall. And so that also went away in the 21 proposed. Those two changes that were due to the full year of salaries and the end of the incremental lapse are why that budget increased slightly. But there are not other increases in there. There was also a few additional positions added for the register mid-year, and they actually, in the proposed budget, had a slight increase for that. But there is not
overall, the general fund was to be a decrease of $8.5 million in the proposed budget.
Thank you, CFO Crosby. Commissioner Jones, did that answer your questions?
Partly,
Okay.
but I have some more questions.
I've got another, do you want to continue?
Yeah, because
go right ahead.
I just
Go right
think
ahead.
we got to get to a certain point.
Just one moment. Let me ask for a mulligan. Just let me allow Commissioner Sawyer a mulligan or to interrupt you just for a second. Commissioner Sawyer.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. Thank you, Chairman. So, I'm confused. Can we break something down?
Please, go right ahead.
This is going to sound really elementary, but this is round like 3 or 4 of this. We were presented a budget by the administration, right? That's the book we received on electronically. We are no longer following that budget, right? No?
No,
No, we are not.
we're not.
Okay. We are using the FY20 budget as amended.
Really hasn't been amended yet. That's what
I mean, as amended, as the
the
final
amended,
adopted.
yes,
So the final version of the FY20 budget
amended,
amended, right? So everything that we did last year,
yes.
we took out all recurring, we're not repeating any one-time grants, right? So those are out of the FY20 budget.
Right, they
So
took
for
away
example,
some of that, yes.
Like Girls Inc. got $1 million last year, it's not in there again for this year, so things like that.
Right,
Then the adjustments that we made, that we voted on amendments, are to this FY20 budget.
yes,
To fund the amendments for FY21 plus what would need to be funded for FY20, that's where the proposed line item cuts will ensure. The proposed line item cuts are cuts from the FY20 budget or from what the mayor's office proposed?
it was what the mayor's office proposed. This is why I'm saying, let's get back to the FY20. Let's readjust the revenue sources and expenditures and all of that so that we can find out what amount of a deficit exists.
So that's my question, because what's this? These proposed cuts, I think did you get one? We need one more, please. This list of proposed cuts comes from, that we have right here. Who wrote this document? Matilda, Mayor Harris's office?
Commissioner, just so we can keep order, just real quick, to respond to your question just for a second, do you mind if I interrupt you just for a second? I'm sorry. Commissioner Sawyer, to respond a little bit, let me recognize Mayor Harris, and then I'll come immediately back to you, and then I'm going to go back to Vice Chairman Jones, okay?
Okay, because I'm just
I think
trying
this will
to,
help.
yeah, I'm just trying to understand. It feels like we're dealing in two budgets.
I totally agree with
Okay.
you. I think it's a very good question. Let me recognize Mayor Harris, and then we'll come back to Commissioner Sawyer, and then we'll go back to Vice Chairman Jones. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll see if I can add clarity, but it'll be difficult, but I'm going to try as best I can. So what I passed around is more or less the Ford-Jones budget proposal. These are their cuts because we have a deficit, and the way you resolve the deficit is new revenues or cuts. So this is a list of all of their cuts. So this, in effect, could be boiled down to their budget. So what do you see here in their proposed cuts? The top half is our FY21 budget. Everything listed at the top half is in our FY21, and they wrote it down a second time. All right, so that's our FY21 budget. That is not enough to cure the deficit because they've taken out the wheel tax revenue. So you can't just take forward our cuts without doing more if you take out the wheel tax revenue. So the top half are our cuts, but you've got to cut more. The bottom half are the additional cuts that they have proposed. Every additional cut that they propose, as you can see, is from the mayor's administration. The top half is my budget. The second half, here's another copy. The second half are their proposed cuts, and they are exclusively cuts to the mayor's administration. Right? The problem we have is not really that. I mean, we can talk about, is this the right way to do a budget process or not, and I'm happy to discuss that. That's not quite the problem, though, because what the real problem here is that we don't know whether or not this proposal avoids layoffs. It's difficult to tell what the ramifications of this proposal are. In addition, as we've been talking about repeatedly, this proposal as it stands does not cure the deficit. So no clarity on layoffs, does not resolve the deficit, and thirdly, guts important programs that people in our community depend on. So what kind of programs are gutted by this current proposal? $2.6 million from Workforce Investment Network, $3.27 million from FEMA and TEMA, $245,000 from Community Health, $105,000 from Public Health, cuts to environmental health and health planning, a $9 million cut to the Ryan White HIV program, $620,000 cut to community services agents, $172,000 to pretrial services, and I could go on and on with the programs that the community depends on that would be cut if you were to vote on something that resembled this. So you wouldn't cure the deficit, you could possibly cause layoffs, and you would gut programs that happen to be under the mayor's administration, but that deliver vital services to folks in the community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Sawyer. And then I'm going to go back to Vice Chairman Jones.
Thank you, Mayor. And again, and thank you, Chairman. Let me just get my red pen out, or pink, because pink is better than red. Mayor Harris and Commissioner Jones, I'm just going to take a moment of privilege because I know when you get the mic back, I'm not going to get it back for 30 minutes. Mayor Harris, you mentioned these cuts to programs that you mentioned, where they're not spelled out in this document. So how can we find where they're cut?
They are spelled out. So in other words, if you look at the the total of the additional cuts made is $20,282,000. That's the total. Right. Everything else was already in my budget.
So like when you say Ryan White, what line item is that?
So if you look at the series of cuts, 282, 286, and 287 describe their cuts to health services. Okay. And those cuts to health services then go down to the line item. Yes.
Got you. Thank you. Okay, so this is how the cuts look, and this is why we've been talking about two budgets, because to get back to FY20 and then to handle the deficit. So Commissioner Jones, when the mic goes back to you, can you just answer a question for me? Are we aware of the programs that will be impacted by what we've adopted? And how will we ensure that that essential work continues to go on? And then also, how will we ensure that next week we're not in the paper for layoffs? I don't want that next to my name, or to be responsible for anyone to not have a job in FY21. So I just want to make sure here, is it a matter, I guess my question is it a matter, Commissioner Jones, of us adopting, the mayor responding, and us coming back again to see where we fall? Or is there something else that needs to be done before then for us to identify the impact that these cuts have? Thank you.
Vice Chairman Jones.
Thank you. Specifically to what I just said, it is not this commissioner or this body to cut out essential services. In any budget, we're not cutting those services. All you got to do is, if it's new money, get the numbers right by adding it to the FY20 what's on the table, and then let's look at what deficits we have. We've been getting two sets of numbers from the proposed and this. So until we correct all of this new money, okay, we're in the FY20. Now you got new money. Put the new money over in the FY20. This is the only way you're going to know exactly what your deficits are. We're not cutting anything, these essential services. They will still exist. Most of them are grants. And they're going to come in, and it's got to be added. So we're not getting rid of Ryan White. We're not getting rid of our WIN monies. That's not even an option on the table. It just has to be implemented into the numbers so that we can find out using the FY20 budget with those adjustments, if that answers your question. And until we get to that point, we're going to be kind of stuck. But I saw Commissioner Morrison had her hand up, Chairman, and had a question. If that answers your question, Commissioner Sawyer.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. We're going to go in order. Commissioner Morrison, then CFO Crosby, and then Commissioner Lowry. Commissioner Morrison, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Budget Chair Jones and Commissioner Ford as well. I know you all have put so much time into this, but at the same time, I wonder if someone on the prevailing side that voted for these 23 million cuts might want to reconsider that, because perhaps there's a way we could get there faster if we looked at it by line item, would just be one way, or by department, in making sure that we didn't cut services. Just a suggestion.
Thank you. Are you done, Commissioner? Thank you, Commissioner Morrison. CFO Crosby.
Commissioner Sawyer, I'm really appreciative of the budget staff, because after this was adopted 2 weeks ago, they took this information and ran it through to look at what it would be by fund and by department. And so behind the screen at last Monday's commission meeting, there was another spreadsheet that we didn't happen to turn to, but it broke out what these reductions are by fund. It did not show did not have by department yet, but it did have it by fund. No, it was a spreadsheet that was up last Monday. The amount of general fund cuts in these 2 pages is $8 million. One way to kind of get the question of having multiple budgets aside would be if this body were willing to go with the proposed grant funds budget and special revenue funds budget and internal service funds budget. If we could kind of carve those off, then we could just talk about the general fund. And there have been requests to come more closely to the grant funds budget and budget that differently. We can take that into recommendation and try to get some staff to look at that over the coming year. But it would be, that is not possible to look at all of the detail right now and get that level of detail. And so one way to kind of simplify this would be to say, okay, we will take the proposed budget with the grant funding that is available. Let's set that aside and let's focus on the general fund, which this did have $8 million of general fund cuts. 2 of those are already in the base budget number, but there were $6 million of incremental cuts in this.
CFO Crosby, can you be more specific when you talk about adjusting the grants? Be more specific if you don't mind. what your proposal is.
My proposal would be to accept the grants fund budget as proposed. There is an Exhibit A that goes onto the budget resolution that has a column for each fund. And if this body would be willing to just accept the grants fund budget as proposed, then we would not have these reductions to.
How many pages is that? Is that something I can print out here?
Yes, the proposed Exhibit A that was in the mayor's.
Can we get that to our staff, and let's make a copy of that and pass it out to the commissioners?
Certainly. I'll have the Exhibit A itself.
Can you email that to the commissioners?
Certainly.
Can you do it now? Or have one of your staff do it?
It's actually already in your budget book at the back of it if you do have that with you.
I've got a copy, but do all the commissioners have a copy? Let me remember who's on first base, second base, third base. So we're going to get you commissioners a copy of that. We're at the Peabody. They're pretty sophisticated. They'll get us a copy if they need it, if we need one. So we'll come right back to that. I just wanted to be more specific about the CFO's comments. It is in the book, but not everybody has that with them. Before I go to Commissioner Lowry, who is next in the queue, did you have a mulligan? Commissioner Sawyer. Mulligan.
Thank you, Chairman. CFO Crosby, can you say again what you are proposing, those funds? You say grants fund?
Internal service funds, special revenue funds, and enterprise funds.
And enterprise funds. So we would be discussing general education and debt service?
Yes.
Okay, and then in the grants fund, does that include our grant program?
No, it does not.
Okay.
The commission's $2.6 million is in the general fund.
Okay. Got you. And then I would like to hear from the budget chair / co-chair if they are amenable to this, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sawyer. Next in the queue is Commissioner Lowry. Commissioner Lowry.
Thank you, Chairman. And maybe this will be answered in the documents we're getting, but going back to, as we're discussing the mayor's proposed budget and what's on the table now, and as we talk about or hearing the term layoffs and things of that nature, is there a bottom line number that can be communicated as far as what's needed for there not to be any layoffs whatsoever?
It depends on where the cuts are made and how they are made. There's some departments that are fully staffed, and to take any reduction in personnel expenditures could potentially cause layoffs. But there are other departments that are not fully staffed. There are some departments that have huge levels of vacancies, but those vacancies may be needed to meet state regulations, such as the sheriff. So there is currently a large initiative to hire workers for the health department. If there were departments that needed to take a reduction in personnel and those people needed to be replaced, we could give them first priority in other job openings that currently exist.
Sure, I appreciate that. I guess I'm trying to get to understanding that, so we're not speaking in hypotheticals. So if we cannot do department by department to say what's needed and what's not, I guess I'd like to get to a final number that says this is what's needed so none of that occurs, instead of us speaking in hypotheticals. Is that possible?
Sure. I was under the impression that when it was initially proposed, the mayor's budget of 13.6 million in reductions would not cause any layoffs, because we were allowing departments to shift between O&M and personnel dollars, and they could have taken larger cuts to O&M, they could have taken cuts to personnel, such as the budget back to actuals or eliminating vacancies. But it really, I can't tell you how those elected officials would choose to take the reductions.
So, I'm sorry, Chairman, just one last question. I understand that. So based on the, I understand the mayor's proposed budget, but based on the work that's been done by the budget committee, commission committee meeting, there's been no work done, or maybe no discussions or determining what layoffs that would cause if that was to be adopted?
The reductions that have currently been adopted by the budget committee are 1.4 for the elected officials and a net of 6 million for other general fund reductions. That's a total reduction of 7.5. So the mayor's budget did call for significantly more reductions than that. It did call for 13.6 million in reductions. Because even before we get to the additional amendments that are being considered, there were items in the mayor's proposed budget that are not currently on the table here. The level of funding for the sheriff is not commensurate with what the mayor's budget had. There was a inmate medical contract, additional funding for that that's not currently on the table here. There was parental leave of $830,000 that's not currently on the table. And there was an additional subsidy needed for corrections due to the fact that there is no fund balance anymore at corrections, and that was $4 million. So there were additional adds that seemed to be unavoidable expenditures.
Commissioner Lowry, if you don't mind, do you mind if I let the mayor respond to some of your questions? And then I'll come back to you. Okay. Mayor Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The short of it is it's very difficult for us to prognosticate about what the layoff environment looks like, because I can't control the budget decisions of each one of the various offices and how they will navigate cuts if cuts are to happen. Those offices are generally autonomous. If this were a different kind of government, then I could tell you exactly what every cut leads to in terms of layoffs, because I would be in control of every decision that is made. So the best we can say is our original budget, which was about 13.5 million in cuts, has a chance of no layoffs. And the probability of layoffs goes up as you get above $13.5 million in cuts. Who's to say how high that probability gets? But what we do know is the median salary and fringe benefit for a county employee is $73,000. So every $73,000 in additional cut above the original budget puts one job in jeopardy. Every $73,000 above the original cuts puts one job in jeopardy. And so that's the landscape. $73,000 in cuts puts one job in jeopardy, possibly.
Commissioner Lowry, you have the floor.
Chairman, that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Good question, Commissioner Lowry. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Commissioner Sawyer. Move. You're a little closer than 6 feet over there. What happened? Commissioner Sawyer. Where's Rebecca? I need a picture. Go ahead.
So, I'm confused. Again, because my mulligan here, thank you, Chairman, is that we've been talking, I don't know if you remember April. It's been a long time since then. But I said on the record then, why are we talking about cuts? It seems theoretical. And then now, every time we read about the budget, it says that we are headed to a budget process that's going to cause layoffs. I've got how many emails do we have? A couple hundred emails in our inboxes saying no layoffs, no cuts. So this has ballooned into people believing that the commission is actively making personnel cuts, which we are not, right? So what you just explained to us is that dollar amounts may impact certain budgets, which may impact personnel, and that final decision is the leader of that department, right? That's not the same as us saying we're gonna lay off a couple hundred people. Am I wrong?
You're correct. I mean, we're not saying we're going to lay off people. It's up to the departments. If you do a department cut, it's up to them how they take that. Do they have, to the line items that Commissioner Morrison put in her budget, do they have travel that they can eliminate? Because nobody's traveling
Because where are
this
we
year.
going, right?
Do they have furniture and fixtures that they can eliminate? Because do you really need to redo your office this year? Do they have, can they, not buy some office supplies? Do they have a stockpile in their closet? So those are the kind of things that we work through with the departments to eliminate. Now, there were questions raised by the elected officials, such as the trustee, with the 3 lien sale review contracts that were executed this year that were approved by the commission, I think in January, rather than the one that was there last year, and that the spending was going to be higher on those this year. So there's some things like that that maybe contractually there are new contracts that keep that O&M funding in place. But in many cases, there would be opportunities for those departments to cut those, and they could decide where those reductions were to be.
Okay, so I just wanted to be clear about that, because what is happening in the outside conversation, which influences our input, our vote, et cetera, is the belief that we have been going into this budget targeting jobs. That is a dangerous belief for people to be receiving. And what you've just stated to us is the clearest that I have heard this, is that our cuts impact department budgets. And those department budgets, as you said, could impact, they could decide, I'm not traveling next year. I'm not buying purple pens, I'm only buying the cheap black Bic pens, right? Whatever. But it's not necessarily that we are going into this budget laying off a certain number of people.
Correct. And the way that we were working with the departments, 2 of the main ways are in Commissioner Morrison's proposal as line items. One of those is taking the budget back to actual salaries, because a lot of times the budgeted dollars for a position are greater than that person is actually paid.
Right. I just wanted
and the vacancies in excess of vacancy savings.
to be clear that we have not made personnel cuts.
Correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner Sawyer, very good points, really good responses. CFO, Mayor Lee Harris.
Very quickly, Mr. Chairman, let me be clear. A cut is a cut, right? A cut is not something that is not real. A cut is a cut, and I prefer this commission not cut more deeply into county government and the programs that this community depends on and put jobs in jeopardy, because a cut does have to manifest itself in a place, either a program or personnel. It has to occur. It is not a fake thing. If you decide to cut more than that is in my proposed budget, something has to happen. A program has to give, or a person or a personnel or a job has to be put in jeopardy. That is the reality.
And Mr. Mayor, I would just echo that. I'm on board with our commissioners and with you to try to find a pathway to a good budget. And we know, I've spent my entire career in nonprofit. The only way things happen in nonprofit, like at Commissioner Milton's nonprofit, is it's on the backs of people. Most nonprofits run it. 70% of most people's budget is people. And I think it's probably somewhere in county government, isn't it about 70% of our budget is people? And so when we do talk about a cut, while Commissioner Sawyer is very concerned about layoffs like we all are, I personally think that while the intent is not to lay off, but 70% of most people's budget, and am I right, just help me, CFO, is 70% of our budget basically people?
Yes.
Okay, so we're about like any other nonprofit. We run on people. We don't run on supplies or a whole lot of contractors. We run on people. Commissioner Brooks knows that at FedEx. Commissioners, we are making really good progress. We've had some really good conversations today that I think have been very thoughtful. We've gone for another hour. Our hours sort of click by really quickly because we've had really good conversations. I'm going to allow the Peabody to go ahead and set some salads down. If you, commissioners and for elected officials, if you'll sort of clean a space in front of you, I know you got a lot of papers, but if you'll clean a space so they can drop some salads and some lunches. I want to allow the Peabody to do that real quick. It'll also give you a chance to take a break. We'll eat fairly quickly, and then we'll come back to business. In the meantime, I know one outstanding item was, and I know our staff's working to get it, is you brought up a good point, Ms. Crosby, about grants. I want to be sure we all get a copy of that when we come back from after lunch. So again, enjoy your salads, enjoy your lunch. Thank you for being here, and we'll have a working meeting once we're about done with our entree, okay? Thank y'all so much. And so we're going to recess. Thank you.
One, two, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Let me see if I can. That's where the problem is.